Good afternoon. I'm Bill Rasmussen, Senior Museum Collections Curator at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, and welcome to Curators at Work, which is a regular series where our curators share stories about working with our collections. It's part of this series is part of a vast library of online programs that we offer under our Virginia History at Home initiative. So if you're not aware of that, you can go to our website and go to virginiahistory.org/at-home, and then you can see all sorts of things that are programs that are available to you. They're all free. They include podcasts, webinars, virtual tours of and hours of recorded lectures. And before we get started, we always like to thank our members, because none of the work that we do would be possible without their support. Because remember, we are not a state institution. We do not receive state operating support. And so it's through private donations that we're able to preserve and share Virginia's story and offer programs like this. Now, if you have any questions or comments, and I think this topic today may provoke some questions and comments, you leave them in the comments bar, and we'll do our best to discuss them as part of today's conversation. My subject is Virginia and presidential. Now, that means I'm going to look at the 8 Virginia-born presidents, Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Harrison, Tyler, Taylor, and Wilson, and look at some of what they accomplished, what they wanted to accomplish, and show you some of the paraphernalia in our collection that dates back to their actual campaigns for office. But a part of that subject is a history of polarization in presidential politics, a subject that we know well today. And it was extreme in the 1790s and early 1800s. And so all of a sudden that becomes very relevant today to look back and see what was going on then. When we scheduled this program, none of us ever dreamed that the events of the past few weeks would happen. And because of them, I've had to adjust my conclusion a little bit. I'm not as optimistic as I once was, but I'm getting ahead of myself. This all started because back in September, I was asked to write an article on Virginian presidential politics for our quarterly magazine. And here is the magazine that came out just before election, and the story got the cover even. You see some of our objects. And that's the core of what I'm going to present to you today. But what I'm doing today is going to be better because I have it illustrated with paintings that were done at the period of the various presidents. So you can see what they actually looked like and get a better understanding of them. So I'm starting with this quote by Thomas Jefferson, which really lays it on the line, where he says, "Nothing can be believed which is seen in a newspaper. Nothing can now be believed which is seen in a newspaper. Truth itself becomes suspicious by being put into that polluted vehicle." Now, I think today Jefferson would include with the newspapers television, particularly cable news broadcasts, and social media. Now, Jefferson thought newspapers were essential. There's another famous quote he gave where he said that you have to have newspapers to inform the public. There's nowhere they're going to know what's going on. But I would rather have newspapers and no government than a government with no newspapers. So you've got to have them, but they've got to be fair. They can't be partisan. So that's an early image of Jefferson. I think I've got a blow-up of him next, so you can see it just as well here. It's a painting. It's the image of Jefferson that John Trumbull came up with when he was about 20 years younger than that quote. And it's the image that Trumbull used in this famous painting of the signing the Declaration of Independence. So if you go to the next slide, and my colleague Haley Fenner is making this whole program work. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought we had another one. That's fine. I'll stay on this for a second. Soon after the Revolutionary War and the creation of the United States, American leaders realized that they differed in their visions of what the new nation should be. Southern agriculturalists like Jefferson and Madison envisioned rural settlements self-governed by responsible landowners. Nationalists like George Washington, now we can go to the next image, envisioned, they learned while they were fighting the war that they had to have a strong central government, or the new nation wasn't going to survive. And then the third group was in the North. Of course, there were agriculturalists there too, but there were also merchants, and there were the beginnings of industry. There were some industrialists, and they all had a different vision of what should happen. So that's the background behind the first two presidencies, behind the presidencies, two Virginia presidencies, the presidencies of Washington and Jefferson. Washington was elected for 2 terms. He was unanimously chosen by the electors. There were a half dozen of them, and the rest of them had less than half the number of votes that he had. And the one that came in second place was John Adams, so he was the vice president. But Washington was the first and only president who didn't want to be president. He only did it because the nation desperately needed him. He was the only person that everybody trusted and respected. And that was obvious. It's obvious why he had won the revolution against all odds. And then he had relinquished his military power, which amazed European observers. So he became, at that point, he was the most renowned and respected man in the Western world. So he had nothing to gain from being president, and he accepted the position because he was desperately needed and no one else was so admired. And what you're looking at now is this incredible button in our collection. This is part of the Frey Collection. Dr. Alan Frey lives in our part of the state, lives here in Richmond, and he put together an extraordinary collection of hundreds of political objects, and he's given this collection to us, and this is probably the most outstanding one in my point of view because it's so early. It celebrates his election. You can see his initials in the center, long live the president, and those letters circling it are the initials of the 13 colonies. And this button was the equivalent of today's T-shirt or hat that people wear to show they supported a particular candidate or that candidate was victorious. Well, political problems soon emerged even during Washington's first presidency. The prospect of a mercantile and industrial America was the antithesis of Thomas Jefferson. So the next slide, we'll go back to Jefferson. He envisioned an agrarian society free from the evils of urban life, although when he was in Paris as ambassador, he certainly enjoyed the evils of urban life. But he was against that in America. And then there were people in the North who were appalled at the slave-supported society of the South, and those were Federalists. And so, if I go to the next slide, in George Washington's cabinet, he had two arch enemies, Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State and Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury. Jefferson was an obvious choice for Secretary of State because he spent time abroad in France. Hamilton was the obvious choice for the Treasury because he was an absolute genius in terms of finances. And Jefferson wrote later about himself and Hamilton. We were daily pitted in the cabinet like two cocks. They were always fighting one another. And Jefferson tended to lose them to the point that in 1793 he just retreated and left and resigned and went back to Monticello to form an opposition party. And their different visions of the Federalists and Jefferson and the Southern agrarians, they flooded the newspapers when the issue of the debt crisis came up. The nation was horribly in debt after the Revolutionary War, because in order for it to continue, the states had to borrow money and the central government had to borrow money, and they were horribly in debt. And so the Congress turned to the new Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. You're looking at here. This also is a John Trumbull image of him, of a John Trumbull painting. And they turned to him to solve the problem. And the way you paid off the loans was you had to get more loans. And how in the world do you do that? Well, you have to be able to convince the lenders, which would be European investors like the Dutch and individuals in America. You convince them that you know what you're doing. And Hamilton was able to do that. And the other thing you have to do is you have to pay off all your debts, because if you don't have a record for paying off your debts, then who's going to lend you money? So Hamilton said the debts have to be paid off, the state debts and the national debt. They all have to be paid off, and they all have to be done on the national level, because if you don't, you'll have states competing with the national government to pay off the debts. And then he said, in order to pull all this off, I need a national bank. And that was what Madison and Jefferson didn't like at all. So that's the painting of Madison is a Thomas Sully copy of after Gilbert Stuart. Both of these are in our collection. So Jefferson and Madison just did not want to surrender the state debts to the Treasury Department, because they said that would enormously strengthen federal power, and it would weaken state authority. And to agrarians, a central bank threatened to further development of a mercantile economy. It would enhance the reach of the federal government. It would weaken the power of rural America. And if we go to the next slide, we'll go back to George Washington, make the point that he opposed political parties. And Jefferson formed a political party. And parties, their purpose is to either achieve power or retain power. Washington wanted nothing to do with that. He wanted the new nation to succeed. Well, the passage of Hamilton's policy spawned an opposition party. And Jefferson and Madison, they called that party the Republicans because it was a republic that had been founded. Modern historians refer to them as Democrat Republicans, which is very confusing, but they wanted to make the point that the current Republican Party is not directly descended from this. Although if Jefferson and Madison came back today and you told them they were Democrat Republicans, they wouldn't have any idea what you're talking about. But they competed in the election of 1796, but lost. John Adams won. And then they were victorious in 1800. And each side, starting in 1796, each side controlled a newspaper. And the newspaper was like today's cable news stations. Facts weren't very important. Opinion was extremely important. They were unabashedly partisan. They could be scandalous, and it didn't matter if they were erroneous as well. And in this new political divide, each side believed that the future of the country was at stake, and that the opposing party was a mortal threat to the heritage of the democracy. Sound familiar? I think I heard that a lot this past fall. And this extreme polarization went for 2 centuries. It went unmatched until our time, until today, where exactly the same sorts of things are being said. In 1800, the presidential election pitted John Adams again against Jefferson. Here's an image, a St. Memon image of Jefferson showing him a little bit older. And I couldn't resist putting this portrait of John Adams in by Gilbert Stuart. And I say that because it's done much later. He's much older. It's 1826, but I think it's one of the most spectacular portraits ever painted. So I had to bring that in there so you could see that, because you really do get to understand John Adams. So just imagine him a little bit younger when the two of them are confronting one another in 1800. Well, we have a remarkable letter in our collection. The 1800 election was contested, but it wasn't contested by Adams, because he only got some 60-some electoral votes, and Jefferson got 70, a number in the low 70s. But Jefferson's vice presidential running mate got the same number of 70 votes, he's the one who challenged Jefferson. We have this remarkable letter. Since it was tied, Aaron Burr tried to steal the election basically from Jefferson. And we have this extraordinary letter in our collection where Jefferson is writing to his friend Judge Archibald Stewart, who lived in Stanton, and he's saying that the election has been thrown back to the House of Representatives. They voted 25 times, and they can't resolve it. And he doesn't know what's going to happen. And if we go to the next slide, we'll see Aaron Burr, who also received the same number of votes as Jefferson, 73, and he wanted to be president himself. On the 36th ballot, Jefferson finally won, and the reason he won was that his arch enemy, his arch political opponent, Alexander Hamilton. If we'll go back to the next slide, we'll see him. Alexander Hamilton did the right thing. He endorsed Jefferson. He said we're totally opposed in every political philosophy, but Jefferson has principles, and I got to respect him for that. Aaron Burr has no principles. Hamilton wrote, "Burr is for or against anything, but as it suits his interest or ambition." That sounds familiar today too, doesn't it? I know. I think I heard last fall people saying that he or she only makes decisions based on his or her interest or ambition. Well, so that was an extraordinary period of American history that has become very relevant in our time. If we go on now to the next Virginia-born president, it's James Madison. He had been an arch foe, of course, of John Adams. Yet in 1809, following his victory in the 1808 election, a major newspaper, we got this in our collection, the Boston Patriot, you see there, in the Massachusetts of John Adams, it's Boston. John Adams is in Quincy, only a stone's throw away. And it published what it said, an authentic sketch of his political life, Madison's political life, that the editors anticipated would be, quote, acceptable to the public. It's entitled Biography of James Madison. And if you could, in the newspaper, it's very easy to read it. So one wonders, why did people need to be reminded of James Madison? He had been on the public stage for 30 years. He'd been very prominent. He was a central player in the writing and ratification of the Constitution. And 3 decades of public service, he'd been active in Congress. He was Jefferson's Secretary of State for 8 years. It seems strange to us that he needed an introduction to the public that was given in this newspaper. But, the explanation is simple, because the same phenomenon is true today. People just forget. The public forgets. The next president, Virginia-born president, is James Monroe. This is a portrait in our collection. It's a copy after Gilbert Stuart by James Bogle. We have these early copies of Washington, Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe, because this Virginia Historical Society in 1850 didn't have portraits of them, and they realized this is a huge gap. So they commissioned copies that were made in the 1850s. And so this is one of those copies. James Monroe felt that it was his turn in 1816 to run for president. He had he had an illustrious career. He fought in the Revolution. He almost died from wounds in the Revolution. He was a senator representing Virginia. He was a governor of Virginia. He was a foreign minister, secretary of state, secretary of war. And we have this extraordinary letter that's the next image that he wrote in 1829 about the Louisiana Purchase, because he was involved in the Louisiana Purchase. He was that important a figure that Jefferson sent him over to Paris to negotiate that. And this letter is written to the former Secretary of War named George Graham. He wrote it in 1829. And he talks about the Louisiana Purchase. And Graham had asked him and said, there's this new book that's been put out by a Frenchman, this Frenchman named Francois Marbois, who had been involved in the negotiations. And he had stated some facts about the negotiations that were wrong. And Monroe explains in this letter what really happened. And these early founding fathers, it's so extraordinary. They had such good handwriting. You can actually read what they wrote. And he explained that he was sent there with the message from Jefferson that you have $10 million to purchase New Orleans and everything east of New Orleans. And when he got there, Francois Marbois said to him, all right, here's the offer that Napoleon is going to give you, $10 million for $10 million. He wants $10 million, and you can get New Orleans, everything east of New Orleans, and everything west of New Orleans. And so I suppose Monroe had to keep a straight face to say, well, okay, we'll do that. And so he played a key role in that enormously important episode of American history. If we go on to the next president, well, the next one is William Henry Harrison. This is a fascinating portrait, a very interesting portrait by Bass Otis that was done in 1841. And he and one of his successors, Zachary Taylor, spent very little time in Virginia. They were born in Virginia and then moved west and made their fame there. Harrison served in the Army in the Northwest Territory. Then he became governor of the Indiana Territory. And in the election of 1840, he was a Whig, and his opponents, the Democrats, made fun of him, said he was just a common man. He was happy to sit in a log cabin and drink hard cider. And the Whigs and Harrison realized they were going to take that gift and run with it. And so they came up with the slogan of Tippecanoe and Tyler too. Tippecanoe was the famous victory by Harrison over the Indians in 1811, and Tyler refers to his running mate, John Tyler. And so on that wall hanging, you see the log cabin, and you see it also in that incredible vase on the left that has on the part of the top, you can see the circular depiction of William Henry Harrison. So that was quite an extraordinary example of presidential paraphernalia. So, we've seen that in our own day. Jimmy Carter in 1976 ran as the common man. Bernie Sanders depicted himself that way in 2016, 2020. And of course, the one that really pulled it off to the greatest bit of exaggeration was Thomas Jefferson, who won the vote and the confidence of the common man. He said he was a common man, dressed down, and when he was in the White House and so on. And of course, he was every bit an aristocrat. Well, Harrison survived only 31 days in office. He gave an inaugural address. It was weeks. There was hours long. He got very ill after that, and then there was polluted water in Washington at the time. The groundwater, they had inadequate sewerage, and this was a problem. So any number of, perhaps both of those facts contributed to his early death. And so John Tyler becomes president. So if we go to the next slide, we can see an image of this is a stunning picture by G.P.A. Healy. George Peter Alexander Healy was a very good portraitist, and I think this conveys that John Tyler had a presence to him, and he was maligned a lot at the time. It was an accident that he became president because of the death of Harrison, and so he was referred to by his opponents as his accidency. It wasn't fair. He had enjoyed a long and successful political career. He had served as a Virginia legislator, had been a governor, had been a U.S. representative, he had been a senator. He greatly admired Jefferson, and he tried to emulate Jefferson. And part of the reason was that his father was Thomas Jefferson's roommate in college at William and Mary, and a personal friend. And so he endorsed Jefferson's concepts of states' rights, of limited federal government, the virtue of agrarian life. In the very bottom of this slide, it's the only image I had of it, is a coin that is that celebrates John Tyler, and it's like the Washington campaign button that we looked at. And so he tried to match Jefferson in every way, and he just about did it, even in the terms of territorial expansion, because he provoked a war with Mexico. It resulted in the acquisition of land encompassing modern-day Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California, and that was comparable to the Louisiana Purchase. This jug in the middle is actually it was made for the campaign of the next president, Zachary Taylor. On the front that you're seeing here, it mentions Andrew Jackson. On the other side that you don't see, it mentions Zachary Taylor. And the point is that in this campaign object was that Zachary Taylor was a great general, just like Andrew Jackson was. They both had extremely important victories. So if we go to the next image, we can see what Zachary Taylor looked like. This is a painting that's on loan to us from Helen Marie Taylor. It's an absolutely stunning portrait, James Reed Lambdom, and you get from this a sense of this man. And one of the reasons he was so successful is called Old Rough and Ready. His father had fought in the Revolutionary War, and as a payment, he was given land in Kentucky, and the family moved to Kentucky when Zachary Taylor was an infant. So he did not spend much time in Virginia. He had a distinguished 40-year military career. It propelled him to high command in the Mexican War, and he was the general who won the Mexican War. He died only 16 months into his presidency, possibly from gastroenteritis, some sort of stomach virus. So people are historians have speculated that it was the polluted water, groundwater in Washington near the White House that killed him. We can only imagine what might have happened had he lived, because he was and there's a coin that shows him another object. He was a slaveholder, but he opposed the expansion of slavery. He said it made no sense to carry it into the far Southwest. And he might very well have been effective in opposing the secession movement of the 1850s, because he wasn't going to put up with nonsense. He's like Andrew Jackson in that sense. When there was a threat in 1832 of secession by South Carolina, he told them, if you try that, I'll come down there myself and put an end to that. Zachary Taylor was the same sort of person. We can only imagine what might have happened had he lived. We can think today of parallels to that. What would have happened if John Kennedy had not been assassinated? How would the Vietnam War and how would the civil rights movement unfolded? Of course, we can never know that, never answer those questions. And so the final president, a Virginia-born president, is Woodrow Wilson. And here is the only image I have of that sheet music that you see there in the center. When I saw that we had this in our collection, I was so anxious to read the lyrics, because he's known as a progressive, and there's the title of the March Progressive. And I was greatly disappointed to get the sheet music and open it up and find there are no words to it. But it must be a sprightly song. But obviously the title refers to his reputation as a progressive. Of course, progressives of today would have nothing to do with him. They wouldn't want to be in any way associated with him, because he was progressive in a lot of ways, but not in the least in terms of racial justice. He simply was a racist. Um, he at the time he was greatly respected because he brought reform to a lot of endeavors. He brought it to banking, he brought it to trade. He ended unfair business practices such as trusts. He improved the handling of farm loans, and he changed the tax structure. So he made a lot of advances, but little in terms of social justice. He also remains a hero of progressive internationalists because he was a pioneer of American interventionism. He articulated this foreign policy that America's goal and our responsibility is to make the world safe for democracy, and America stayed with that directive through much of the century, and until it's prevailed until the 21st century, when American failures in the Middle East have caused us to rethink that and realize that not all the world wants a democracy, and even if they do, we can't always pull it off and enable that to happen. That all goes back to Wilson. It was reinforced by Truman in the 50s. So this in the article. Oh no, I'm sorry, I forgot I had the portrait of Wilson. It's a fascinating portrait. It's by a man named Frank Graham Coots, done in 1936, 12 years after he had died. So he obviously did that from a photograph. I'd never even heard of Frank Graham Coots, and it turns out he's very interesting to us because he's born in Stanton. He went to the University of Virginia, and he was actually quite successful in his time as an illustrator, and also for doing important portraits like this one. So this brings me to the conclusion that I wrote back in September, and I cited there this famous letter in our collection that Jefferson wrote in 1814 to his friend Walter Jones. Jones had asked him, what was George Washington really like? And this is 15 years after Washington had died. It's Jefferson's presidency has been over for 6 years, and the suggestion from this letter is that polarization is forgotten. It's forgiven and forgotten soon. Jefferson had feuded so much with Washington. They had totally different views on so many things. But in this letter, he says, Washington, quote, was indeed in every sense of the words a wise, a good, and a great man. You have to say that about Washington. How can you not say it? And he said, we were indeed disappointed with him on his ratification of the British treaty. He's talking about the Jay Treaty that favored France, that disfavored France and favored England. Washington put forward that policy because France and England were trying to destroy one another, and America was going to be caught right in the middle of it. And Washington's determination was to keep America out of the war in any way. And since the British had the greatest navy, he made a treaty with Britain. And so Jefferson says, we were indeed dissatisfied with him on his ratification of the Jay Treaty. But this was short-lived. And I am convinced he is more deeply seated in his love and gratitude of the Republicans than in the homage of the federal monarchists, for he was no monarchist. Jefferson and the Republicans were so fearful that Washington and Hamilton wanted to have a king in America, so they were sort of obsessed about this fear of monarchists. Well, this letter to Walter Jones, it just goes on and on about Washington, where he says, he just says one thing and then he sort of contradicts himself. And for example, he would say in one paragraph, his mind was great and powerful without being of the very first order. His penetration was strong, though not as acute as that of a Newton, Bacon, or Locke. And sort of by implication, Jefferson was the great intellectual too. No judgment was ever sounder, but it was slow in operation. But sure in conclusion. He planned his battles judiciously, but if deranged during the course of the action, he was slow to readjust. but he was incapable of fear. The strongest feature in his character was prudence. He was, in every sense of the word, a wise, a good, and a great man. His temper was naturally irritable and high-toned, but he had a good, firm, and habitual ascendancy over it. However, if it broke its bonds, he was most tremendous in his wrath. Well, Jefferson was a visionary. Washington was not. So you can imagine where his temper changed at times regarding Jefferson. So it goes on and on for like 4 pages, just like that. And by the way, you can easily read this letter if you just Google. If you can remember Walter Jones, he's the one that Jefferson wrote it to in the year 1814. Just Google those 2 facts. You can read the whole letter. It's in our collection. And I have not paid much attention to the first page in the past because the next 4 pages are so powerful by Washington. But in the first page, he goes on at length again about the newspapers. And he writes to Walter Jones and says, "I deplore with you the putrid state into which our newspapers have passed, and the malignity, the vulgarity, the mendacious spirit of those who write for them. These ordures," I had to look that one up, dung is the word, what the word means, "are rapidly depraving the public taste and lessening its relish for sound food as vehicles of information. They are becoming useless by forfeiting all truth, all title to belief. And this has in a great degree been produced by the violence and malignity of party spirit, by the partisanship." So there we are. We're back to today and to the partisanship that we face today. So at this point, if I've opened this to any comments, if anyone would like to react to the past history and its relevance today, because your opinion about today is every bit as good as mine. I'm less optimistic than I was back in September.
Hey there, Bill. So while we wait for folks to submit any comments that they have, you mentioned earlier that part of the collections that we saw today were from the Fray Collection. Can you tell us a little bit more about that collection?
Well, it's a vast collection. It's several hundred items. I have not gone through all of it. It's something I look forward to viewing, but it's full of all sorts of paraphernalia. And our photographer, I mentioned the magazine. Our photographer laid out a number of things in this shot, just to give you an indication that the collection includes all sorts of things, lots of campaign buttons, of course, but a fan, ribbon, and all sorts of various sheet music, various objects. So it's an extraordinary collection that we have.
Wonderful. So we actually do have one question. We have a viewer who wants to know, the comment has been made that the election of 1800 was just incredibly brutal, right? And so the question is, do you think Washington, if he were alive, could have changed that?
Oh, no, that's a great question. He certainly would have done everything he could to change it. And in his farewell address just in 1799, he warns about the political parties and the partisanship. And he was greatly frustrated during his 2 campaigns. For almost 8 years of his 2 campaigns, he was faced with this vitriol going back and forth between Jefferson and Hamilton. And he was greatly discouraged by that, and he couldn't stop it. He might have been successful in 1800 of tampering it down a little bit. But that's another one of these questions we can only guess.
All right. So far, I'm not seeing too many other questions come in yet. I will let everyone know you can continue to submit comments and questions in the comment sections of our Facebook and YouTube pages. So if you see this when we're not live, you're welcome to submit comments and questions there, and we will try and get back to you. We do have one other question for you, Bill. Why are you less optimistic now than in September?
Well, because the partisanship just seems to have gotten so much worse. I mean, no sane person could have imagined that the Capitol would have been stormed on January 6th, and that the violence that we saw most of the summer in Seattle and Portland and Minneapolis and Denver, it picked up again 2 nights ago. Hopefully that'll end. I didn't hear anything on the news today about it happening last night. But if our leaders are less interested in reconciliation and more interested in retribution, then the partisanship isn't going to go away. So I'm just, I have my fingers crossed that it will, and I imagine I join many people in saying I'm exhausted with all this discord that we've had to listen to for months or years now.
Yeah, absolutely, Bill. So I think that kind of covers the questions so far. We will give folks just a minute or two in case there are any other burning questions.
If they are, while we're waiting, Haley, I'll mention our next program next month.
Oh, certainly. Our
Curators at Works program will be in February, and this is a program we offer only to our members, and now is a great time to give a gift of membership to your friends and family, and you can find out more about the programs for members on our website. But the subject of the February talk, it sounds quite intriguing. A tale of 2 trunks. One trunk is the trunk owned by Mary Custis Lee. She was the last of the surviving daughters of Robert E. Lee. And this is something that came into our collection in the last couple of decades, and it was full of surprises. And the other trunk is a trunk owned by sharecroppers in Prince Edward County, who had been slaves, and that family had attained freedom. And this came into our collection recently. And since you never know what you're going to find in a trunk, you better tune in to see. So we hope you'll join us on that one too.
Awesome. Well, folks can visit our website, virginiahistory.org/events, for more information. And Bill, it looks like I think you might have left everyone speechless. So I think that we don't seem to have too many more questions.
Well, thank you, Haley, for making this happen. So we'll and thank you all who tuned in today. We'll see you in February.